Today we will talk about a road known as a legend in Vietnam, the Ho Chi Minh Trail. However, not everyone knows that within this legend lies another legendary path that engineers from China, Russia, or the United States would marvel at upon seeing. It is the petroleum pipeline along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a route that American generals could never have anticipated, leading them to exclaim, "Vietnam's petroleum pipeline is a true legend." From 1968 to 1974, the Vietnamese military managed to build a petroleum pipeline totaling 5,000 kilometers, making it the longest pipeline in the world at that time. It took China another 15 years to build a longer one. Thanks to this pipeline, vehicles could get fuel to transport goods into the battlefield, and tanks and airplanes could fight to liberate the South and unify the country. It was so crucial that the logistics department's leadership once said, "If we had to gild it to make our comrades able to build this pipeline, we would not hesitate." So why is this road called a legend? It's because Vietnam had to construct it with such meticulous effort. Everyone knows the United States as the forefather of the oil industry and the nation that abandoned the gold standard to establish the oil standard. Therefore, more than anyone, the United States understands how important petroleum is for any country. Vietnam's question was how to supply gasoline for vehicles to carry food supplies, for airplanes to fly, and for tanks to get fuel for combat. Because of this, in 1968, all vehicles transporting gasoline and oil to support the southern battlefield were heavily attacked, forcing the Vietnamese military to devise all means possible to transport gasoline and oil to the southern battlefield. How to bring gasoline in without being detected by the enemy? Immediately, the plan to put gasoline in plastic bags and carry them in backpacks on foot to the battlefield was implemented. However, this method could not be sustained long-term, as it was not efficient. 200 people carrying but not even filling 2 barrels. Not to mention, many soldiers suffered from gasoline intoxication, lead poisoning, or even died during transportation. This method was not feasible, so Vietnam switched to using 20 oil cans for gasoline or dragging barrels of gasoline across streams. This approach also could not last long, as it took up to 2 weeks to bring in supplies that would only last vehicles for 2 days. Eventually, the Vietnamese military came up with a solution to gather everything that could be called a pipe and connect them into one pipeline, from water pipes to bamboo tubes. This method proved to be quite effective as the Vietnamese military no longer had to exert as much effort. However, after a short time, they could not use it because the bamboo could not withstand the pressure, and after a while, the gasoline leaked out. Trying 100 millimeters might work, but connecting thousands of kilometers would not. During a trip to the Soviet Union, General Vo Nguyen Giap saw their oil transportation method and brought it back to Vietnam to apply. One would think the problem was solved there, but the situation in the Soviet Union and Vietnam was completely different. First, the Soviet Union had an excellent air defense system, while Vietnam did not, facing American bombings. Secondly, those pipelines were only used for short-term campaigns and were dismantled after, whereas the Vietnamese military needed it for a long-term strategy to liberate the South, questioning its long-term usability and maintenance. Third, Vietnam's mountainous terrain was extremely complicated. Generals in that meeting were silent, looking for solutions. But immediately, Lieutenant General Dinh Duc Thien volunteered and promised General Vo Nguyen Giap to research and urgently implement it. The execution problem was even more challenging as it always had to ensure secrecy. It must be kept secret to proceed. Without secrecy, it was not feasible. This forced Vietnam to conduct intense surveillance, not letting American intelligence detect the pipeline locations. This seemed straightforward, yet Vietnam did it well. But America still managed to bomb the pipeline locations, even those not yet installed. At this point, the Vietnamese military had to solve a much more challenging problem: how to install the pipeline to overcome the highly scientific and meticulous calculations of the Americans. Any pipeline crossing a river had to be submerged to avoid being swept away by floods or destroyed by bombs, importantly remaining undetectable by the enemy. Land pipelines had to be buried deep down by plowing, with farmers continuing to plant rice on the surface as usual. In flat areas, Vietnam's problem was solved. But what about mountainous, steep terrains? Ordinary installation would surely be destroyed by American bombs. But not installing it meant having to place it up high on mountain passes up to 1,000 m high. But at such heights, how could pumps pump oil over? with pressure on the pipes reaching up to 400 atmospheres, risking pipe bursts. Eventually, the Vietnamese military thought of using pumps to gradually pump up in stages little by little, until finally the gasoline and oil could pass over the mountain passes without affecting the pipes. This was considered a Guinness World Record at the time, as no country dared to think, let alone do such a thing. Fortunately, no Guinness World Record confirmed this, because if there were, we would have been exposed. One might think that solving the most challenging problems meant everything was resolved, with gasoline continuously flowing into the battlefield, ensuring the military's peace of mind in combat. However, unfortunately, in 1972, the US returned to bomb Hanoi and Haiphong, preventing Vietnam's gasoline and oil supply from Russia from reaching Haiphong port. This time, Vietnam was forced to install a pipeline to Lang Son to receive supplies from Russia, transported from the port of Fangcheng in China. That's also why the total length of Vietnam's petroleum pipeline at that time reached 5,000 kilometers, the longest in the world then, making Americans exclaim that Vietnam's petroleum pipeline is a true legend. The U.S. Defense Secretary McNamara once declared that the U.S. electronic fence was impenetrable by even a mouse. Yet somehow, convoys of the Vietnamese military, carrying thousands of tons of supplies, continued to move normally to support the southern battlefield, and nobody could stop them. The McNamara electronic fence, designed by 47 of America's brightest minds, cost up to $2 billion at the time. Thus, it became a weapon that the US had immense confidence in, intending to cut off the supply line from the north to the south of Vietnam. The most popular and talked about device at that time was referred to as the tropical tree, and it was known as ground surveillance. This was a device the US dropped to pick up ground signals, thanks to its 4 antennae. Every laugh, word, or footstep that made noise on the ground was captured and immediately relayed back to command centers. Within a minute after that, aircraft would be deployed to strike, ensuring that almost no one could escape. As a result, all the supply trucks supporting the southern battlefield had to cease operations and were stuck in a deadlock. The question now was how to solve this problem. The challenge posed by the brainpower of America's 47 greatest geniuses was evident. Whether on foot or in vehicles, there was no hiding, especially considering the need to transport supplies. However, the Vietnamese military eventually discovered the weakness of the ground surveillance by having the engineered troops survey each cargo trip in advance, tying the device's antennae together, which immediately neutralized the product of America's 47 greatest minds and even turned it into a weapon against them. In areas where the Vietnamese troops wanted to clear paths, they would place the tropical tree there and create false signals for American bombs to plow the area. After the area was plowed by the US, it just needed to be flattened with a bulldozer. Before any major battles intended to deplete the enemy's strength, they would drop the tropical tree at a pre-selected location and then have trucks drag a large amount of metal through. Where there was no metal, empty barrels were used instead. All the barrels banging together loudly misled the US into thinking a large number of Vietnamese troops were marching there, prompting them to call in airstrike. But the trouble was, after bombing, the command center would receive information about another large convoy passing through the old location. This pattern repeated many times, forcing the US to question which were the real supply convoys and which were diversions created by the Vietnamese military. The more they bombed, the more bewildered they became, uncertain if their efforts were yielding any results or just wasteful expenditure. American pilots were extremely frustrated with the ground information relayed to them because it was mostly incorrect. Even American soldiers joked among themselves that it seemed Vietnam could intervene in their command system, rendering the genius product of America's brightest minds into scrap metal. Yet, that wasn't the end. With a determined effort to block the supply line from the north into South Vietnam, the US military also deployed planes known as Ghosts atop the Truong Son range. These had night vision equipment capable of amplifying still images up to 40,000 times, allowing for the observation of targets in the dark. They also had highly effective sensors that could detect electrical pulses emitted when a gasoline engine operated. All this data was fed into a computer on board the aircraft, which then calculated a freeing solution to the target. The remaining task was performed by guns and cannons mounted on the left side of the plane. With meticulous calculations and the ability to pinpoint vehicle locations to the millimeter, The AC-130 Ghost destroyed and damaged many of our vehicles. Despite its precise shooting capabilities, the Truong Son trails back then were very narrow, fitting only one vehicle. If it shot and punctured the tire of one vehicle, the following 100 vehicles would have to stop due to traffic congestion. And when stopped like that, planes in the sky would bomb them, leaving no way to escape, resulting in significant losses of life and resources for the Vietnamese troops. The immediate challenge for Vietnam was figuring out how to continue supplying the southern battlefield under these conditions. If this situation persisted, transporting anything into the area became impossible since the vehicles were interconnected. A single damaged vehicle could result in the entire convoy being compromised. The Vietnamese military quickly invented a solution by digging fishbone paths along the main roads. Any vehicle damaged by aircraft could immediately pull into one of these paths, allowing the rest to continue smoothly and avoid being targeted by US bombs. This was how we countered the most advanced US technology at the time. However, all these methods were only temporary and short-term solutions because, with such advanced technology, supporting the southern battlefield could not meet the requirements set forth. So, how did the Vietnamese military manage to overcome America's cutting-edge electronic devices back then? Film director Michael McClear of The 10,000-Day War once stated that the Ho Chi Minh Trail was developed under ancient conditions, like in the 12th century BC, but the battles on the trail utilized advanced techniques, heralding the 21st century. This comment can show us the correlation of forces between the US and Vietnam on the legendary Ho Chi Minh Trail back then. As we learned in the previous episode, the AC-130 planes back then were able to use infrared night vision devices, amplifying dim light up to 4,000 times, detecting electrical sparks when a car operates. Thus, wherever there was a moving car, the US could know and have its soldiers attack those vehicles, supplying the South's battlefield. The question for Vietnam now is how to escape from this terrifying weapon dubbed the Spectre, with the principle that no matter how modern a device is, it must have a weakness. So at all costs, Vietnam had to find its limitation. The AC-130's drawback is its large and cumbersome size, slow flying speed, usually flying at an altitude below 3 km, which made it afraid to fly during the day for fear of being shot down. This inadvertently made the task of supplying the South Vietnamese battlefield somewhat easier for the Vietnamese troops. If Vietnam's night transportation was fiercely attacked by the US, then they could run during the day when the US could do nothing. Not to mention, running at night, Vietnam could only move at about 20 kilometers per hour due to darkness and dust. Now, moving during the day could achieve speeds of 30 to 40 kilometers per hour, doubling the productivity, as it would be easier to travel by day anyway. However, the problem with moving during the day for show is that they also didn't dare to move in the midday sun because US reconnaissance planes were very sensitive back then. Reconnaissance planes like the U-2 would buzz overhead all day. Once a target was spotted, they would drop smoke bombs to call in other planes to bomb. Knowing the AC-130 flies slow and slow for reconnaissance, but using cannons to shoot it down was extremely difficult. Not to mention, if you decide to shoot it down, the first shot must hit immediately. If the first shot doesn't hit, Vietnam would expose all its positions. So, how to move during the day without being detected by reconnaissance planes? The Vietnamese engineers came up with the method of creating secret roads and covering them with layers of forest foliage overhead for vehicles to travel below. Now, they could only be called early morning or late afternoon runs, around 5 a.m. or 5 p.m., taking advantage of some sunlight, as those were times when reconnaissance planes no longer operated, and the AC-130 did not dare to appear. Yet, American generals were not novices in tactics, so the question posed for Vietnam now was how to not expose these secret routes, still supply goods to the south without being seen transporting at night. Then, when and how should they transport? Not going at night meant Vietnam had to move during the day. Thus, they had to use deception to fool the US. At night, they would still have to turn on the lights bright, running on open roads that Vietnam wanted the US to know, to attract enemy bombing. Not only that, but they also dug tunnels and placed explosives inside, which when operated would create electrical sparks just like in a car, making the US believe that they were still operating within their control and bomb away. Any damaged vehicle or goods were pulled into the road to be burned, making the US think it was destroying many of our targets. Even more, Vietnamese troops had to deploy anti-aircraft guns to protect the route, to make the US certain that this was Vietnam's lifeline. So Vietnamese troops were doing everything to keep it. However, all of that was just a deception tactic that the US could never have imagined from the Vietnamese troops. They deceived so well that the reconnaissance planes detected the foliage-covered routes, thinking it was done for night operations only, not for daytime use. The US even laughed that they had developed weapons to detect targets through infrared and electrical sparks from internal combustion engines, so no matter how much it was covered with dense foliage, it couldn't escape. Thus, the US left those tree canopies for Vietnam to do whatever they wanted, thinking that all these efforts were futile and time-consuming. However, in the end, the US realized Vietnam had shifted from night-to-day operations to supply the South, and inevitably, day-fighting aircraft without modern electronic equipment, like at night, had to bring the AC-130 out during the day to detect and attack Vietnamese targets. However, the issue was, Vietnam only feared the AC-130 in the darkness. In the light, it was nothing more than a clunky piece of metal with wings, because it was heavy, slow, and couldn't fly too high, and Vietnamese cannons could shoot it down anyway. Moreover, during the twilight and dusk, US reconnaissance planes couldn't see where the Vietnamese cannons were to drop smoke bombs for coordination, and this was the pinnacle of Vietnamese military art. No matter how modern and powerful the US was, the peak of military strategy still made the enemy fight according to Vietnam's will. After shooting down 2 AC-130 planes on March 29th and 30, 1972, the US had to remove the AC-130 from the strategic supply line, and then in 1973 had to completely withdraw, realizing that they could no longer compete with the Vietnamese troops. So the question is why, after bombing Vietnam for years, did they not know about the secret routes that were still being used for transportation? How did Vietnam hide them so well that the US couldn't detect? Then, after the liberation of the South, Lieutenant General Jong Sin Nguyen saw a map of the Ho Chi Minh Trail at the headquarters of the Saigon Army and smiled. It turns out, for over 15 years, they knew of its existence, but it was just for fun, as it had no effect on military tactics. How did the Vietnamese troops hide those secret routes? The answer will be in Episode 4. After the war, when asked if there was anything the Americans could have done to achieve a different outcome in the conflict, General Vo Nguyen Giap replied that if it had been possible to sever the Ho Chi Minh Trail, greater success could have been achieved. However, what is noteworthy is that the advanced technology of the Americans was unable to completely disrupt Vietnam's Ho Chi Minh Trail. Over more than 10 years of conflict, the Americans only had a vague understanding of it, never truly grasping how Vietnam transported goods to the southern battlefield. With the motto, "Move without traces, cook without smoke, speak without sound," the Vietnamese military went to great lengths to ensure that, regardless of the sophistication of American technology, they could never be detected. In the early days of the trail, the troops had to march and transport goods manually. Moving without leaving any traces was a mandatory practice for each soldier, as revealing any signs of passage could lead to ambush and total annihilation by American forces. The Vietnamese military devised numerous methods to erase their tracks after each march. Sometimes they would place a wooden board under their feet to avoid leaving footprints, other times plastic sheets were used, and the last person in line was responsible for erasing tracks. In some cases, to deceive the enemy, an entire group of 100 people would follow exactly in the footsteps of the person in front, giving the impression that only one person had passed by, thus suggesting the movement of troops was minimal. When moving along stream banks or through forest paths, the guide always followed specific signals left by the preceding group, ensuring that seeing an unusual arrangement of stones by the stream or an abnormal branch could indicate what to do next. For example, at a stream fork, not knowing which way to turn, one could disappear the direction by spotting 3 stones stacked in an unusual manner, indicating a right turn. These signals, predetermined among the guides, were not known to everyone, making them difficult to detect. Later, when vehicles were needed for transportation, hiding tracks became more challenging since vehicles could not erase their tracks, and the engine noise was loud. To address this issue, the Vietnamese military divided the road into small sections assigned to individual drivers, each responsible for memorizing a segment of about 30 to 40 kilometers. Driving at night, in near total darkness, required the drivers to know each tree and blade of grass on their route. On clear nights, the moonlight provided some visibility, but otherwise, drivers relied on their senses, inadvertently avoiding detection by American daytime aerial surveillance, ensuring commanders' confidence that captured drivers could not reveal the entire Ho Chi Minh Trail. Bridges crossing rivers were built under the water surface, so that reconnaissance aircraft looking down would see reflections that made them assume these were ordinary rivers, not realizing bridges were there. Certain road sections were deliberately surrounded by large bomb craters, suggesting they had already been bombed, thus discouraging further attacks. This blend of reality and deception kept the US military from discovering the route as used by Vietnam to transport goods into the battlefield. Only Vietnamese generals and Nguyen Luong Khan, the person who drew those maps, had complete knowledge of the trail's routes, with maps intentionally drawn with a 10-kilometer error margin, understandable only to the Vietnamese military. Even if these maps fell into American hands, they could not pinpoint the exact locations, which explains why General William Westmoreland of the US military refused to believe he had lost in Vietnam until his death. He acknowledged defeat by stating that the qualities of a great military leader include decision-making ability, mental strength, focus on a single goal, and the intelligence to converge these qualities. General Vo Nguyen Giap possessed all of these. That concludes today's historical discussion program. Thank you for your interest and attention. Remember to subscribe to the Legends of History channel.